Okay, cool. So yeah, maybe we'll have someone else pop in, Dylan. We'll see.
All right.
But yeah. So okay. So I'm just gonna record this like whole session like instead of like trying to make it like nice and neat because it's for your guys' cohort. But could you guys already had done or should have done the mod 4 project, right? You've done your
Yeah.
assessment and everything.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Just wanted to make sure that's out of the way. I just want to make it clear, right?
Yeah,
Maybe there's
sure.
some maybe there's some differences for personal like different people, but I think for the most part you guys are done. So
Yep.
good. So that means you guys are all like focused on Capstone now. Like that's kind of like your goal. And this is honestly one of my favorite parts of like when you guys are here because it's like there's no really new material anymore. Like there's nothing new for you to go through necessarily. I mean, there's always going to be new stuff for you to learn as a data scientist. But essentially you have all the tools you need to, and this is going to be your 5th project now. So Capstone's kind of a really special time. And you also have like, we're going to talk about the timeline going forward, but you basically have like just under 2 months to do the capstone, which sounds great, but also can be kind of intimidating. Thinking like it's like okay, like what do I have to do? What are like like to what extent do I have to make sure I have everything done and all that stuff? Or like is it my caps? Usually I get the questions of like is my capstone enough? You know, like that kind of thing. So we're gonna kind of go through that today. But so let me go ahead. I'm just going to start sharing my screen a little bit, and that will be the easiest thing. And we'll kind of talk through like what this looks like, what Capstone looks like, and everything like that. Let's see here. Cool. Let me just move my windows around because it's a little easier to see everything. All right. So this also, like at least a version of this, what's it called? This notebook is on my repo. And I know, Dylan, were you here before? I know I subbed once for a lesson. Were you here on that
Yeah.
group?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think I shared that. I usually just do share this all the time. So this repo right here, I'll just put in the chat too. I don't know if you have access, have you already seen it before, but I guess if anyone else comes into it, they'll see it in the chat. But what I do is I just put like this, at least a version of this notebook is in here under projects, oops, and Capstone. And so you can at least pull this up. So that way, you know, if you wanted to go back on it or, you know, anyone watching this recording later on can go back on it and then check it out and everything like that. So anyway, this little guy though, it won't be on the repo. It's a little specific to you guys. So that's where like all the due dates, and I'll put this in the calendar and such. But it's kind of important to kind of like talk about like what this is. So I mentioned like there's the actual, oh, I said my repo, but also there's the repo for the capstone requirements. So actually saying, you know, things like what is the capstone, what are the requirements? And this is where like I'll tell you is that I think the curriculum sometimes can be a little too restrictive on capstone. For example, the one that sticks out to my head is make use of supervised learning. It says it's great to use unsupervised learning, but like it's not needed for this project or should play a central role in answering your question. I kind of disagree with this because I've seen students who have done really great jobs who haven't focused specifically on supervised learning. And really what your capstone is about, it's not these check-off points. It really is about having an end-to-end project that you can show and talk to about, you know, with an interviewer, a technical recruiter. Basically, if someone asks you, says, hey, tell me about a data science project you've done, that project should be the capstone. And the reason why is because you can talk about saying, you know, from the first beginning part of like what the business problem is. And I always say business because it doesn't have to be literally a business problem. It can be something like for a nonprofit or other organization, right? But your stakeholders, like what is the problem for your stakeholders? Collecting or acquiring the data, which can come in so many different ways and stuff like this. And then carrying it out all the way through analysis, exploration, you know, even cleaning, you know, before when you're getting the, acquiring the data into actually like understanding like, okay, how do we approach this problem? And then usually that's where modeling kind of takes in, where it's like, okay, like, can we make predictions so we for future, like what can we do for the future? But it doesn't necessarily have to be that. A data science project can also be like this capstone, can also be much more based around analysis. And it doesn't have to, like, I like to say is that machine learning isn't always like the central like thing in a data science project. It typically can be, but there's a lot of ways you can do analysis and talk about a project. And I've had, I know I had a couple students already who had used at least like unsupervised learning essentially as something to give weight to their analysis to kind of confirm what they're looking at, and which is a pretty cool thing. So anyway, just kind of take all like these like requirements as a grain of salt, because what it comes down to is really coming with an end-to-end project. But useful to go through this, because what you guys will need is what you basically, Capstone is just like a module project but bigger. So you'll need the same stuff, which is like a Jupyter notebook for your technical presentation, right? And presentation, it's not really a presentation, it's more like a discussion walkthrough. But you have your Jupyter notebook for your technical part. The biggest thing that we kind of like ask you to add in there is an abstract section. Since this is kind of like an end-to-end project, it's useful to have kind of like at the beginning of being like, I don't like the word abstract because that sounds very academic, but like essentially like a summary of like, what's the point of this, you know, project? Like what was the problem? What things did you do? What solutions did you come to? And it's like 1-2 paragraphs. That's kind of the biggest difference for like this Jupyter notebook that you've been doing. The other part is having a README, which should already be doing on GitHub. So again, it should always be on GitHub repo so people can check it out. And the README, again, just like a summary, a little bit more, much more than the abstract, but like something that someone initially sees so they can actually look at, say, what's this project about? And say, oh, that's really cool. Let me go ahead and dive into the Jupyter notebook that you have uploaded onto the repo. And then of course you have the blog post that's associated with your project. So these should all be pretty familiar stuff. And then one last thing, which I noticed it's not on the requirement, is also, I'm trying to look through this right here. Why is this saying? Oh, interesting. Sorry, I got distracted. Also your non-technical presentation of saying like, what are you going to like present to a non-technical stakeholders? So that's a really important skill that I think really shines a lot when people talk about an interview, is also having something that shows like, hey, I did this really technical thing and did a lot of work, but not only can I do this, but I can convey this information to someone who's not in data science. And that's where data scientists really earn their worth, where basically you can convey information to someone else who doesn't know anything about this stuff and have it meaningful and actually gain insight. So that's kind of like what we're looking for. So it's basically the same thing as the project, but just bigger. Makes sense so far, Dylan? I know I can't see you, so you should ask for a thumbs up.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay, cool. Thanks. All right, no problem. So let's kind of talk a little bit like what this capstone looks like and stuff like that. So I kind of said like the requirements, but like I said, like an end-to-end project. And again, the goal is really so you can like talk to, my expectations for you guys is that it's a project that you feel like you own. Like you can talk about your project to someone else and someone can say, oh, have you thought about this? Or, oh, that's really interesting. Like, did you see any issues with this thing? And you can pretty much say, oh, yes, I have thought about that, or I have dealt with that. Or you say, you know, I didn't see that specifically, or I didn't think about that specifically, but I think this is how it would tie into the rest of my project. Like, essentially, you can have a discussion with someone, and it's not just going to be like a thing of like, oh, I did this thing. And someone said, oh, like, was it, like, did you have any issues? Like, oh, yeah, I had some issues. Like, it just has a different feel to it versus like a discussion on a project. You can hear people, like in an interview setting, you can hear people talk about it and you can hear the excitement and kind of like understanding of what's going on. And that's really what my goal for you guys is, to not just to have this last project that finishes like your, you know, time here at Flatiron, but really just to have something where you guys can go now into an interview and be able to discuss it. So that's kind of like what I'll kind of like guide you guys towards, right? Some expectations, right? So from you guys, like I said, you guys should feel like you'd be able to talk about this in an interview, show that you can pull insight. And that's kind of like I mentioned just earlier, is that the real worth that you're going to show is like, hey, can you not only just do something technical, but can you actually like communicate that? And again, this is where I think where so many really smart people don't do well in interviews, in trying to get data science jobs. Like, and I'm not saying that just people like students like you guys are in Flatiron, but even people who like get PhDs and stuff, go through graduate programs, sometimes they just have a difficult time to frame something in a business problem and a solution in easily understandable words, and saying, okay, what can we gain? What knowledge can we gain from this to people who are not data scientists? So I think it's kind of like you guys have been practicing this basically for the past few months. Like you guys should feel pretty comfortable. So these are expectations for me, like that. Like expectations on me essentially is I'm here to guide you, right? So all the instructors, like you'll kind of hear us kind of like come in and kind of help out a little bit, but my thing is always like, I'm here to guide you. I'm not here to hold your hand, but I'm going to definitely make sure you don't fall off a cliff like trying to do this stuff. Make sure you don't like bang your head too hard against the wall trying to figure out a problem. I'm going to help you kind of organize kind of stuff, so I'm going to give you a little bit of due dates kind of coming forward. And then like giving advice on what your project, like what direction your project might take. So making sure that you don't make it too broad, but also not too narrow. So that way you can finish it on a in a timely manner, but then also have something that you feel that you can like really talk about versus like just some, I think sometimes people, usually this is not the problem, but like going the opposite direction of being like too simple where there's not really interesting things to talk about, or there's just not as much excitement from you for doing that project. And then of course, like any advice like beyond the technical or technical work. So that's kind of like what, we as instructors are here for. And that's kind of like where I'm going to help you guys with the capstone in particular. Okay, cool. So I'm going to move on then to timeline. All right. So for this cohort, so I'm going through a couple other cohorts with Capstone. So you guys aren't the only ones I'm helping out with. So your guys' specific timeline is August 17th to October 9th, which, obviously right now it's the 19th and stuff, but that's kind of like the timeline that's like, okay, we've started now Capstone. So the main thing to do first is like to realize that we need to actually choose this data set. This is going to be different from like the Mod 4 project where essentially you have data already kind of given to you. You get to decide what your actual problem is, your business problem, choosing the data set or data sets that are going to be relevant to answering that question. And so one thing you need to do then is basically figure out what the problem is, and then also like what data sets are going to help you come to that solution. And so this August 28th is like a Friday. It's basically kind of like this soft due date of like saying you have to choose your problem, choose a data set. And when I say choose a data set, that doesn't mean like, oh yeah, I have this problem and I found this data set, but I never downloaded it, never looked at it, never done anything with it. It should be at least a little basic EDA. Can you take the data? Can you actually import into a pandas data frame and just check out, is this going to be sufficient? Or do you think it's going to be sufficient for this project? You don't have to do anything too crazy like analytics and stuff like this, but just get a feel for the data set to say, okay, is it useful? And so this due date right here, basically, it's going to be me. I have a little spreadsheet to make sure, I keep track of everyone, right? And I'll like, I want you guys to message me. You could put on the full Slack channel, for the cohort channel, basically saying like, oh, this is the project I have, and this is the data set. And just so I can double check that you're not going to run into any snags with that data set or that problem. So classic examples are either the data set is just too small to scope out that full project. So we kind of have to rearrange maybe how we talk about the project problem, or maybe get a different data set or supplement that data set. The other one is sometimes people have really ambitious goals for their capstone, and that can also end up into some issues as well, like trying to do everything within a relatively short amount of time. This is not a graduate thesis. Like this is not a PhD thesis. It's going to be a project that you can talk about and kind of frame that. And speaking of that, it's like if you do have like lofty goals, like, oh, I want to do all these amazing things with this one project. It's not that you can't do it or not saying that's a bad project, but Capstone will kind of like say, all right, let's get it a focus to an end-to-end project, like at least like some viable project that you have. And then if you want to, at the end, when you graduate, you can expand on top of those projects. And I see a lot of students do something like that, especially if they have like a really good idea that they really want to implement and talk about. But having that first end-to-end is going to be super important, again, for their interview. Does all make sense so far, Dylan?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. All right, so that's going to be your first deadline release, August 28th. And then after that, once you have your data set, basically these are soft dates, really. Data explored and cleaned. I have a September 4th. So that way you have like time to actually like take your data, explore it. And the idea is that by the September 4th day is that you have all your data you need. You've cleaned it out, so you kind of found any like weird stuff or inconsistencies in the data. And you've explored enough where you have a good idea of how you're going to use the data now to answer your problems. Or answer your questions to your problem. So you can think of it like if you're doing a supervised learning technique, you're thinking like, okay, I have the data now in a form that is ready now to basically be put into a model and me trying to make predictions. Or if you're doing more of an analysis side of saying, okay, I have all the data together and now I have to really just like do the actual analysis of like, like what are we looking for in here? So that's kind of this due date right here. And you can notice like this due date right here, like in this one, these are like rough ones. So like if you do this way before, that's like the best thing possible. If it takes you longer, September 4th, it's not a big deal. It's not like I'm gonna like, say, oh, minus 10 points off of your capstone assessment in the future. But I might kind of like just message you a little more frequently, say, hey, I just want to check in and see how it's going and everything like that, just to help you kind of like stay in pace so you don't have the capstone become something that's just dragging you down versus like you moving forward. Okay. And then after that point, you're just working on your capstone, putting all the pieces together, and then we'll start doing assessments September 28th. And then we'll actually have the last day, which is your graduation day, is October 9th. So October 9th is basically like the official calendar is like the only real deadline and due date that is like actually from like essentially Flatiron's program. So the goal is for you guys all to have your assessments completely done. And by assessments, I mean like everything's turned in, your blog posts and stuff like that. So you have it completed and you can graduate on time. You don't have to worry about any extra little weird details because something came up. Of course, I will tell you, like, if this does happen, if it starts getting closer to October 9th and like things are looking like it's not quite done, we can definitely talk and figure things out, just like with the mod project. But my goal for you guys is so you can get done with your capstone and just think about applying for jobs and finding your job and finding your career. I don't want people, like I've had people dwell on capstone for, honestly, quite a long time, a lot longer than the original plan was. And it's not bad. They eventually finished, and got things done. But I do know it's like, it does weigh a little bit on your soul of like saying like, oh man, I need to get this done. And also like at this point, you guys should probably starting to think about like jobs and what to apply to and like, start a job search and stuff like that. And so it's nice to be able to say, all right, I'm done with capstone. Now I can focus just purely on looking for a job or, looking for a new position. Okay. So that's a general timeline. Do you have any questions, Dylan, at all? It's kind of framework.
No, I'm good. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. So that's kind of like the overall, like what the capstone looks like, what that, like the structure of like the timeline and everything like that. Some advice. So like one big thing is that you're going to have to be picking a data set, right? So some advice I give is that there's a couple ways you can go into this. You can make it related to an industry that you're going to. So if you know what industry you want to go towards, like after this program's done, you want to like search for these specific jobs, the more you can like gear your data set and your problem, or I say your data set, but really your project to the industry, like it might be really helpful because then you can actually talk about that with like, let's say for example, the industry you're going into is like finance. Like, well, it might be really useful to actually talk about a finance-based problem, right? Like saying, okay, maybe you want to do something with time series, maybe you want to do something along those lines. But I will say is that don't also feel like you have to do it this way. One thing that people usually say is like, I'm not really sure what direction I want to go in. I just know I really like data science. And in that way, it doesn't matter too much by itself what project in particular, because the goal is to have a project that you have end to end that you can talk excited about. And I even say is that even if you know what industry you're going, I think there's nothing wrong with doing a project that is not necessarily related to that industry, because it's all about saying something that you like care about and something that like gets you excited to do. And whatever project you do, like that should be the goal, where someone can feel the understanding and excitement that you bring to it. I have a personal example for myself is that one project I had done early on, I guess a few years ago, it's been a while now. Time's starting to blend together. But I did a project with taking American Sign Language, what they call like classifiers, which are, I can say classifiers, they're actually like finger spelling. So there's like letter A, B, C, D, like all that stuff. And actually seeing from images, can you actually determine what letters being signed and stuff like this? And, I spent time on that. I did, really dug into it. It's something that I thought was really interesting. And I took American Sign Language back in high school, so I kind of was familiar with the domain. And that's one that I like. I've never gotten anywhere in, I never had any job or anything like that even was close to something that I like doing that. But I guarantee, like, almost every time I brought that up with someone, from a technical side, like there was always interest, and like it was always like, hey, like that's really cool. Like tell me more about this. And I could tell them about all the details and like, like, oh, there's some issues with like, the classification, for example, this is an A and this is an S. And so my convolution, for example, had those mixed up, but they mixed up in interesting ways. That's the kind of thing you're gearing towards, is having a project that you can talk about and like feel excited about and have enough knowledge where someone can ask you a question and you can address it right away versus being like, I don't really know. So that's kind of like my goal for you guys. And usually it's not about the good project, the project that's the right project to pick. It's more about the project that you're excited to talk about. Okay. That's kind of like my advice for this part. Don't use boring data sets. I kind of say boring data sets, but basically if it's too simple of a data set, like especially a lot of categorical values versus numerical, it just, sometimes it can be much more like, especially with categorical, is that it could just be like, oh, if it's in this category, then it's this thing. And it just becomes like, you can feel it. I don't know a good way to describe it other than being like, it feels bland. I haven't had anyone do this for Capstone. Usually we kind of like make sure there's something that's interesting that you can, you know, pull through in your analysis and basically kind of show off your skills a little bit. But I did have someone do like a mod 4 project. This is kind of like before we had people have specific project, they had chosen different data sets. And in that data set, they kind of had more categorical values. I was like, you know, like this is kind of a simple one. You know, I wouldn't really recommend it. I think you just won't come across anything really interesting to like really practice on. They said, you know, I think I'm going to try for it anyway. But then by the time they did the project, it was a fine project. But after they even said like, yeah, you know, that felt a little too simple. Like it just felt like nothing really interesting of substance came out of it. And so we want to avoid that because if it's too simple, it's also hard to talk about something that's interesting about it. And simple, again, like doesn't mean not enough data. It doesn't necessarily mean like you can have almost all categorical data points and still have really interesting data sets. But this is just why, like in the very beginning, I asked you guys to make sure you approve it by me first before you start working on the capstone. That way I can say, hey, like this might be something you want to, you might, it's like a good project, but maybe this data set's not the one that you want to pursue. So that's kind of like my little bit of advice. And then again, it doesn't have to be completely ML focused. So it doesn't have to be super complex. It doesn't have to be, what's it called? It doesn't have to be only about supervised learning, machine learning. A big part of it is just basically, can you bring insight? And that can honestly be mostly analysis. And I've had at least a couple of students who went this direction and they did a really great job. And they didn't really use much machine learning. I think both of them did do machine learning. I think one did this unsupervised learning project, but it wasn't like the main focus of the whole project, which I think is important to distinguish. Like as a project, you're kind of trying to gain insight, and whatever tool you can do to gain that insight, that's kind of like what you're trying to do for this project. But it also know that most people do focus on that, so it's perfectly fine if you do. Okay. This should really be own subsection, but make sure you use a process, awesome, ChrisVM, some framework to basically help you like guide your process so that way you don't go stuck in any rabbit holes. And this is where I will say like it's like I would say this is more or less a requirement. And the reason why is because you can then talk about your process. You know, if someone says, you know, for your project, like, well, how were you able to, you know, complete this? You can actually say, well, I actually used, you know, the awesome or the ChrisVM framework, you know, to help me kind of like guide my, you know, analysis, guide my project, you know, all the way through. And that will be really important with an interviewer because they want to get a job done. Like if you have a project at work, they want to make sure like it actually gets to completion versus like sitting in limbo for a long time, which, you know I have friends who are PhDs. I know some great people who are PhDs who are working in the field. But this is where sometimes people's experience of people who are more from academia, sometimes they think they're super smart, but like sometimes it's just, they're not quite, they're used to taking a long time on a project versus saying, okay, we need to build this up so we can move on to the next thing. So again, this is why I would say this is a huge emphasis. This is basically a requirement in my book. Okay, and then it can help to set mini deadlines. So making sure you like know where things are, and that's where I try to help you guys here, like with this general timeline. But of course, you know, this is why I leave this little bit gap open. You should also take the time to what makes sense for your timeline going from like week 3 to week 7. Okay, and so that's kind of like my overall general advice. Any question or any comment or anything like that going through?
No, it's all pretty straightforward. Just have to, you know, I'm glad you had the tentative timeline.
Yeah.
The general timeline, because that's good. I need deadlines. Otherwise, I'm just gonna wait till the end and go, ah, damn.
Yeah, that's my experience too, is that
Yep.
sometimes it just helps to have like, and versus like, oh, here's the beginning and here's the end, you
Yep.
fill out the middle. Sometimes it's helpful just to kind of have these parts. And one thing I suggest to students when even making their own timeline is, even for like when you're doing a job, like in like the workplace, is there's always more you can do for a lot of these projects. So it's tough to be like, okay, like, once I get this part done, I'll move on to this thing. The problem is that I'm like, well, when is this, like, when are you done with data cleaning, or when are you done with acquiring data? It can be kind of arbitrary when you think about it. And so it's helpful to actually set on like real like day deadlines of being like, all right, I'm going to do data cleaning. If I get to a point that it's satisfactory, I'll move on. But by, September, 2nd, if I'm not done by this date, I'm going to stop there and move on. And I can always come back to it and do more stuff. And I think that helps a little bit because it kind of puts a firm deadline where you know you can't do everything because there's always stuff you can do. And that can help you kind of like move forward to make sure you have something to show for your project. The classic is like someone, like a manager puts a project together and the person spends, like 3 weeks doing the first bit, and then 3 weeks like, okay, tell me about your progress. Like, oh, we're still looking into it. And it's like, well, we got to do something. Like, like, and it's one of those things that sounds like a joke, but it's totally like I've seen it happen like in the workplace. So it really helps to have a little bit of saying, have you heard of MVP, minimal viable product? Is that a phrase that sounds anything familiar to you?
No.
Yeah. So this is more of a software engineering, but I think it applies a lot for data science too, is having an MVP, basically your minimal viable product, basically something that works. It might not be the best thing. It might not be the thing that you really want at the very end, but having something that works is a lot better than having something that that will eventually work, but it's not there yet. So the classic some people like kind of show is like, if you are like, I don't know, like building some like a moving vehicle, instead of like trying to build each part of the car and it's going to take like a year, but you don't have a car until the end of the year, it's kind of hard to test out and see what that car is going to be and stuff like that, versus like, let's start off with a bike. It's like, well, we really want a car, but at least if we have a bike, we have some idea of what problems we might see once we get to that car, and then you reiterate on top of the bike and you kind of like enhance it and improve it, like an iterative process. Sometimes people talk about this as like agile development. I don't know if that sounds familiar, but it's the same concept there. So that's kind of like where I said, if you put those firm deadlines, it helps you have a product at the end. And your product in this case is an end-to-end project for Capstone. So
Got it.
yeah, anyway. So okay, cool. So I'm just going through, yeah. I know I'm going to be talking a whole lot, so I'm just trying to go right through all this stuff. So stop me for sure, like if you have any questions or like oh, like what, yeah. All right, so fun extra stuff. This is where I think sometimes I personally think people might spend sometimes too much time trying to add this in. And so a dashboard, I think it's not part of the curriculum, but like you might be familiar with data dashboards. If people have looked at like Tableau, I know Plotly's Dash is really useful. And those like basically making an interactive, form of your data, like it's not a notebook. I know that instructor Raphael has done a couple like data dashboard like study groups that kind of like open for other people and stuff like this. These are really cool, and that they can really add a little extra flair to your project. However, I will put a little caveat, a little asterisk of being like, I would not recommend thinking that you're going to do this for the capstone. And it's not because I don't think it's worthwhile. I do think this adds a lot of like, when you show your project to someone, like it's cool to have an interactive, like something that they can play around with versus like reading a notebook. Like that definitely has value. But if I'm being perfectly honest, this is likely not the thing that's going to get you the job. And again, when I go back, like, what is the point of this capstone for you guys? Is to get a job. Like that's kind of what it comes down to. I mean, there is a little bit of context of being like, we want to make sure we kind of essentially test out to make sure like, you've got everything you need. But at this point, you guys pretty much know, like we're pretty confident that you have things figured out. At least that's my my feeling. But that little extra, like you can make it look good and stuff like this. And I will say is that sometimes you can make a really great project And that can actually lead directly to like a job offering. I've even had like people reach out, like the projects I've done, and like it was just on GitHub. It wasn't even like anything interactive. Say, oh, like, this is really cool. Like, can you tell me more about this? Or, like that was really nice. Like, love to talk about the job offering or something like that. Like, that's actually happened to me. And I know people have gotten that same thing and have a good project. However, even as flattering as that is sometimes, like when you apply for a job, and this is where like maybe this is a weird like I don't know how to say this. Like I feel like I'm saying like something that makes it like sound like it's not important, but like a lot of times when people are getting hired, the people aren't going with a fine-tooth comb looking at this project. And even a dashboard, they might not really look at it. They really want to see like, oh, cool, you make this dashboard, but I want to see, what's your work process look like? Like really quickly scrolling through a notebook, I can tell if someone like uses a lot of comments, if people use a lot of like detail of like talking about something. Are they using visuals? Or are they just putting like visual with no words, and then just like a conclusion at the end? Like, I can see how someone works off those projects, where a dashboard can be more like interactive and stuff like this and kind of be like show people something interesting. And the other part is too, is that if I'm being honest, is that you don't know, like this might not help you, because if you use like, let's say Plotly, for example, to like do, or like Flask or whatever you end up using to build up a little fun extra, you don't really know if that's going to be the thing that your job that you're looking for is going to be, like their framework. Like they would say, oh, that's cool, you make a dashboard, but we use this instead, or like whatever it is. And I think sometimes this can take some extra work, and it takes away from like the real meat of like your capstone and like your process. And so I try not to encourage, like, I don't know, encourage is the right word. Like if someone wants to do it, like I'm not going to tell them no. But I worry that sometimes if people focus on this stuff too, you can end up instead of doing the work of a or as a data scientist or a machine learning engineer, you're instead of doing the work of a software engineer, which is a different kind of skill set. And it's perfectly fine to have those skills, but if you're looking for like a job in data science, machine learning engineering, it's probably not the one that you want to focus on. And that's kind of why I kind of describe it, because it's really cool, but like it's also like probably not necessary for a lot of the times that you're applying for jobs. So anyway, I add this in here just because I've seen people do this and act on this, and I think sometimes it subtracts from their work, whether either means that they have to focus less on this, or they spend more time trying to finish it and they go past the due date because they were focusing on this first before they were doing the rest of their general end-to-end. I don't know if that makes sense. You have any questions, Dylan? I know that that sounded very negative for like fun extras, but
super fun.
I guess perspective, yeah.
No,
yeah.
good,
Okay, cool. Anyway, I just add in there because I think it's something that kind of be aware of. So kind of going on some more negative stuff, right? No, but common issues, right? So one is just not having a clear goal, making sure you understand like what is the business problem and what questions are you planning to answer when you finish like the end of that project. I think that really helps. Sometimes people say things like, I've heard people say like, I want to do NLP analysis. Like, okay, but what does that mean? Like, what is the goal from there? And if you don't have that clear goal, sometimes it's easy just like to kind of float around doing stuff, but not really progressing to an answer to questions. So that's always helpful. Thinking you don't have good enough results. Sometimes people think like they have to have good results, otherwise it's not a good project. I'd say no, that's not true at all. This again, it's only going to be done like for the part-time program for over only 2 months. This is definitely not enough time to like really go into far detail and stuff like this and like have like something like state of the art kind of stuff. If you do, really great, like that's awesome. But it's definitely not necessary to like have these like good results. You're really trying to show is like, hey, I can take a problem and I can take it in a direction. And let's say you don't have good results, you can talk about that in your conclusion saying, hey, for future work, this is the stuff I would do to help improve, or this is how I would revisit it. Or you could even do a revisit after graduating, or, doing a spin-off project on top of it to answer a question that you weren't able to really get a good answer to. So this is definitely not necessary for, not just for you to pass the capstone, but also just like to have a good capstone to talk about. It doesn't have to have like amazing results. Other issues, just being careful with data, the size and complexity. That's a pretty common one, just making sure you have the right data. So that's why early on, like letting me know, let me approve it. Thinking it has to be complex or novel. right? Or sorry, not complex, but like actually novel, like something that no one else has done, it doesn't have to do that. It should stand out a little bit. Like definitely don't use like the Titanic data set or data sets that like if you Google it, you see like 50,000 of the same exact data set being used. But it doesn't have to be completely novel. It just has to be something interesting that you're saying, here's a business problem. How do I take this? And that's where I think if you start off with what the problem is first versus what data set you have, you're less likely to land into saying like, oh, like doing something that everyone else has done. And also, what's it called? Like trying to make it like really novel and different than everyone else. I think if you start off with the problem first, I think that's going to be the interesting part. Kind of related to that, making it too big of a project, like just trying to do a lot, just kind of, and this is where like communicating, out what you're doing can be super helpful. It's like, hey, like maybe don't do these parts of it, or maybe we can rearrange this so we can like combine this together. Just making sure it's just relatively timely within this time period. And then one thing people tend to do a lot is not considering the time it takes to learn something. Sometimes people get some really like excited stuff, like, oh, I really want to do NLP analysis, and I want to do text generation, or I want to do, like audio analysis. You're like, oh, that's awesome. It's like, but we haven't talked about any of that. Like, you're going to have to incorporate the idea that you're going to have to learn something new on top of actually doing the project. So just being aware of that kind of stuff. And sometimes we can say, okay, you want to do this thing, but we don't have this knowledge yet. So maybe what we can do is the capstone is focusing on most of that thing, and then you can revisit it and add that piece later on after your capstone. Usually I think that's a good compromise where, you can do something really cool and really useful, but making sure you actually have something finished before you, finish your capstone. So yeah, so that's kind of common issues. Overall kind of idea. Questions at all? Only Dylan?
Yeah, so far so good. I will have plenty of questions.
Yeah.
Don't worry about that. But right now, I'm okay.
Of course. No, of course. And that's where, so I'll kind of say this now, is that we have office hours available for Capstone. And I know one other cohort's actually going through it right now, but I basically have Capstone office hours. Normally office hours will only be like twice a week. But since we're kind of like having it joint, I actually have them 4 times a week. So they're actually at, well, your time, Pacific time, 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Pacific time, Monday through Thursday. And then I guess what time is that in East Coast? 2 p.m. Eastern time, Monday through Thursday. And so those are great times where you can ask any question. You can pop in, ask questions. What I'll probably do for the future going forward is I'll just be there for an hour. And if anyone shows up, people show up, I'll answer questions or discuss things, and people can talk about stuff like their projects and stuff. And sometimes it's useful to hear what other people are doing as well. And then some of those office hours as well, I might have specific, like more like lessons, like kind of like more structured and stuff like that, where I will kind of like talk about something, and I'll put that on the calendar. So that way, ahead of time, like what this office hour is going to be like. Otherwise, just kind of open discussion. And I think I'm going to start recording those office hours. So that way, if someone does like wanted to come there, but they knew someone was going to talk about something, but they wasn't sure about it, they can at least watch the recording or something like that. So yeah, but yeah, feel free. Future questions, there's office hours, and of course Slack. The easiest way I like to tell people is just like go on the Slack channel itself and message out, because then that way everyone, like including other instructors, can check it out. I'm sure you guys have seen Matt Spar and Ben Jacobson, right? Actually, like respond to stuff like that, because they're on there every day. But other instructors too can check it out as well. Yeah, cool. So okay, I think let's see, we're about 20 minutes to the hour. So kind of going back to some references I referenced back to begin with. Let's see here. I kind of want to talk about, I did have an overview of like the capstone, which it's kind of repeated a lot of the stuff I have, but like there were some good questions in there back in January. So it might be worth checking out. I could put that in that repo, as well as like I had capstone discussion. I think I shared that with you guys a few days ago or yesterday. So you guys can check that out too if you want to, but I think you have all the information you need at this point. So I will just kind of quickly go through this little guy. It's just picking a project, like a project topic. This is actually made by, it was made by another cohort instructor. but it's kind of useful stuff. And this is what more like for mod 3, but I think it still applies for a lot for the capstone stuff. So basically I'm gonna kind of briefly go through this, is that remember, like picking your data set, you can have something that's more something that you're excited by. And I think that actually can say a lot, but it can also be something that's like related to the industry you want to go towards. So like if you want to go towards finance, making sure that like you have a project geared towards that. But if you decide not to go in that direction, it's perfectly fine to have another project that you find interesting, or you find that you would, you know, kind of like to explore a little bit more. Some considerations to have. I don't know if I did this. I think I did this last time too. It should be, there you go. Okay. Oh, I think I was messing around. Okay, I remember now. But like making sure your data is big enough. And this is where I would say like, this is a soft like expectation consideration. It's like you can do data science and even like machine learning, even deep learning for smaller data sets, like smaller data sets being like less than 10,000. But having more than 20,000 data points is going to make it easier to find patterns. If it's too small, it might be a little difficult. There are exceptions to this, especially like information dense data, for example, like images or natural language processing type data. That usually has a lot of information that you don't necessarily need to have huge amounts of data points. But if you do have data and you're like, looks really interesting, but it's a little small, just, you know, run it by me and I can kind of give advice a little bit, like what you can do or maybe ways you can supplement it. But I think if you shoot for greater than 20,000, I think you'd be set. Yeah. Some other things to consider: continuous features, like I mentioned. If you have too much categorical data, it just tends to be a little bit difficult to get interesting patterns out of it. Not that you can't, but it just tends to. So just something to consider. Like I said, this kind of relates with the continuous features, that continuous features tend to be a little bit easier to do actual like modeling and inference. I'm sure. Okay, so you can do it-yourself data sets, and this happens sometimes where someone has a data set like, oh cool, like I want to, you know, web scrape this, or I need to clean this up in this way. It doesn't exist, but except for the way I'm doing it, which is cool, but just be aware of how much time it takes. So if you're trying to do any web scraping for your data set, make sure you factor that into your timeline of like how long it's going to take for you to acquire and clean that data. Okay. For the record, like probably like doing your own surveys and stuff like this, it's not a good idea. Like trying to manually collect this data means that it's probably not the right consideration. Anything that can be automatic is going to be a lot better. Okay. Format, just make sure like, you know, JSON, CSV, or an API, making sure you know how to like process that information. Image data, for example, if you're doing some image processing or NLP stuff, understanding how you're supposed to actually read that information to do something with. If it's some other funky format, for example, let's say like audio analysis, you should consider that that's going to take some time to understand what's going on and why this is, what's it called? Like not just why, but like what the data look like and how you're going to actually feed that into your analysis. So just being aware of that. Okay. Am I going too fast? Does it sound pretty good, Dylan?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, again. All right, cool. Yeah, just only because I can't see your face. So I'm also like, all right, I think everything's going well. All right. Yeah, again, these are some like, I don't say that you can't do these data sets, but just kind of be aware because they tend to take time. NLP data sets, computer vision, review data. Oh my gosh, I don't even remember why I said review data. Anyway, DIY data sets, anything that requires human input. If it requires human input, like on your part to process it, it might be a bad idea to actually do that data set, just because that might take way too much time for you to get that information out. There are some exceptions to this where you can use like unsupervised learning techniques to help basically do like a semi-supervised learning, which essentially is like you label some of the data and then you like have an unsupervised learning algorithm help you label the rest of it. But that is definitely a technique that you have to consider being like, that's going to take some time to understand how to do that. And plus you actually getting those inputs. Science focus I kind of threw on here because I think it's kind of important to kind of note is that make sure like, it's not that science data isn't useful or could be used, but just be aware that like, if there is some like specific domain, like what the way that they're talking about the data, it might be over your head of like that. If you're just not familiar with that background, you don't have that domain in that specific science, it might take too much time to learn what that is before you even get into the data. So just kind of be aware of that stuff. Yeah, review data. I'm trying to remember what review data could possibly be, but I can't. Anyway, so project scoping, a lot of people like using Trello and stuff like this to actually kind of like scope out what their stuff. I think overall, like making just like an outline can be super useful and just filling out those dates and figuring out what you need to do. Yes, just making sure you're like, you can always do more, but it doesn't mean you have to. So like, I think that's where it's helpful, like to really have like a firm deadline and like proceeding forward to make sure you don't get stuck into like this one area and like really diving deep, like too deep into it, where essentially you get stuck into like just cleaning the data or just acquiring data or just doing the exploration part. There's always more you can do. So know that it's okay to move on. Yeah. And this is where I have a little few resources of like what I suggest to kind of check out. Google data search. I don't know if you're familiar with that, Dylan, but this guy right here is one of my favorites. It's from Google. Basically, like you can insert like data, like I expect data. It's kind of redundant, but basically it's kind of like Google search, but for data sets. And a lot of them, like Kaggle, for example, is owned by Google, so it comes up a lot. I mean, I guess they also have a lot of data, so I don't know, take it as it is. But basically it searches a whole bunch of different data sets, and you can actually check this out and you can see, you know, for example, even like who's cited it, as well as like the actual source of it, and point, you know, and find these things. So I think this is a really great way versus like you trying to like
what website was that?
Yeah. It is datasearch.research.google. I'll share it in the chat right now. Yeah. And I'll share all of these things too, but let me go ahead and just share it on the chat. Yeah. It's like my favorite thing to just like play around, like just like search for random things, like
find random stuff.
Yeah, like fire. I don't know, like what's fire gonna come out? Ooh, fire incidents. Oh, I didn't think of that. Fire safety. You know, like there's like a whole bunch of things you could probably like end up doing, and a lot of them are really good resources as well. And what's nice is again, like the scholarly article site is really useful. Thanks Google for asking me. Anyway, I think it's really useful. It's a lot better than just trying to search on Google, like finding a data set and stuff. Now, these data sets have varying degrees of quality, right? Of being like, is it something that you can be useful? How much data is in here? But for the most part, you can see they're trying to at least kind of give you some information before you click onto it and stuff like that. But I think this way you can at least find different resources and such. So this is one of my favorite ones to go to. There's other things like the New York City Open Data Portal. I know that a couple instructors have talked about this one. They really liked searching for stuff in here. So it's similar in here. And then I'm sure the other aggregators, Kaggle datasets. So are you familiar with Kaggle, Dylan? It's also, it's also owned by Google, but they have a lot of data sets in here, which can be really useful. And what's nice about this, for example, let's say we click on like handwritten recognition. Oh, this one doesn't have anything. I was trying to hope maybe someone did a notebook on here. But let's go there. There you go. So you can actually find this data set. And what's nice about it is that you can quickly, like with Kaggle data sets, you can quickly like actually see a little bit of like details about the data set and like what's going on. So in this case, there's not that many columns in here, but you can actually kind of explore the data really quickly just to get a feel for what's going on here. And then if it's documented really well, this one's not got too much documentation, but it's all here. There's also net notebooks that people have done themselves. So it's kind of nice to see what other people have done with this data sometimes and see like, it's like, oh, like that's a really interesting way of approaching this, right? I haven't seen this before. So it's kind of a useful way to like look at stuff and see, you know, like, oh, maybe this is a direction I want to go towards or stuff like that. Obviously you wouldn't just like copy this notebook, but like, I think this can help you kind of see what's out there and what people have done. So those ones are pretty useful. And then our data sets from Reddit, their data sets come through there all the time. I don't like it as much because you can't search as easily, but if you just like to see some interesting data sets come through. And then there's also like the UCI machine learning data sets repository. Have you come across this before? Oops, it's a broken link. There we go. I don't know if that's broken.
Yeah, I have been on this one.
Yes, and this one there's some really great data sets, but sometimes
anteater or whatever that is.
Yeah, I think it's an anteater. UC Irvine does it's the anteater.
Oh, UCI.
Yeah. Yeah, you see it fine. Yeah, so they have some really great data sets here. Unfortunately, I mean, one thing about it though, just kind of be aware, is that some of these data sets are kind of small. Like you can see, for example, this one only has 800 instances, but 38 attributes. So kind of be aware of like what's here, but there can be some really interesting ones in here that can help supplement the data that you already have, or give you ideas at least of what directions to go towards. So we're checking out. Yeah, and I'll make sure to share these sources too, to everyone, all that stuff. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of all I wanted to really show right here. I did Google that data set search. I'm just like, I mean, maybe I'm biased because I like Google stuff, but like, man, I just like this stuff I could like just play around with hours, just like look for different data sets to see what's there. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. And then I do have some general advice and stuff. This is actually on that repo I mentioned in projects. So general advice. This is what I usually show my cohorts when they're doing their mod 1 through 4 projects. And it's just general advice about like just parts of the notebook and presentation stuff. But we can talk about this maybe in the future too, since we're about like 5 minutes into the hour. But yeah, that's kind of all I have, kind of talking forward and stuff like this. We'll have office hours starting tomorrow. It's with other cohorts as well, but of course you guys are all open to like attend. That's at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific time. I hope I got that right. That sounds right. I'll put it on the calendar too. I'll put it on your guys' Learn homepage.
What if we can't make that?
Like yeah. So I'll try to do recordings at the very least. But okay. If you do have specific questions, you can always like, just direct message me or ask on the Slack channel. If things go in good direction, just because I'm just have limited amount of time, we might open up multiple office hours. But if you can at least like attend one of them, like that would be really cool. But of course I know everyone's it's always tough. Timing is always the toughest thing for, this kind of stuff. But yeah. But yeah, I'll probably what I'll do for the future and going forward is I'll have it open for an hour and people can come in. We'll see how things go. I can't make any promises just because I have another cohort as well. And maybe in the future we stagger it for like different times and stuff like that work better for you guys. We'll play around with it. We can be pretty fluid, but my suggestion as much as possible, if you can at least attend one of them, if you wanted to ask questions, because they're 4 times a week. But I'll try to record them. Sometimes no one shows up, which is like, like that's like I totally understand. So I'll record it. I'll only really record it if someone shows up. So yeah, that's kind of for it. But you can always message out. Okay. Cool. Yeah, any other questions you got, Dylan?
Not yet.
All right. Yeah, do you have an idea? I'm going to stop the recording here since I think pretty much finished talking. Sound good to you?
Sounds good.
All right.